Hello and welcome to my review of Len Deighton's SSGB, which takes place in 1941 in an alternative history where the Germans have conquered Britain. A remarkably original concept if you ignore Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, which came out in 1962, and Asimov's Living Space, which came out in 1956. SSGB was first published in 1978. Beyond the what-if thought experiment, however, the stories have little in common. Deighton's novel follows Douglas Archer, a policeman who gets embroiled in a convoluted spy story. It begins rather as a whodunit with a dead body found in a London flat. It then introduces the novel's femme fatale, the American journalist Barbara Barger. And the body has unusual injuries, and Archer follows the clues, arresting the dead man's brother, who confesses and then commits suicide. Both men are scientists working for a secret German plan to develop atomic weapons, hence the unusual injuries. The British resistance attempt to persuade Archer to join their cause, and his two German superiors attempt to enlist his help to bring down the other. The British want to attempt to rescue the king, who is being held in the Tower of London, and apparently the German army is willing to help them because it will discredit the SS, leaving them with more power. In the meantime, all the factions are looking for the secret work of the two atomic scientists. The novel is very much split into two halves, and the first half does a good job of depicting a broken Britain licking its wounds, along with the lingering bomb damage. There are hints of the separation of Jews from the rest of society, and also a brief mention of a concentration camp on English soil. The dangerous SS commander Huff seems a worthy antagonist, always a step ahead and exuding menace, while Barbara Barger represents the hope of a better future, not just for Archer, of course, but for the whole country if the Americans can get involved. However, the longer the book goes on, the less interesting it gets. Barger is rather written out of the novel, eventually dying off camera, if you like, in a rather pointless way, given just how little effect she's had on proceedings to that point. She deserved better on both counts. So pointless is her death that its motive requires explaining in Huff's exposition dump at the book's end. And even then, it doesn't really seem necessary. She really is a fringe character, and by this point has been replaced even in her limited role by her ex-husband Daniel, an American agent whose involvement could just as easily have taken place with a phone call. It becomes clear that despite the convoluted and occasionally unconvincing squabbling between the myriad German factions, that the most ruthless villain of them all is actually Colonel Mayhew of the British resistance. The fact that our hero Archer fails to notice this rather seems to confirm Huff's opinion of him as a bit slow. Archer is a hard character to warm to. Despite some pithy comments to various minor characters, he is content to plod along in his job under the German boot heel, and up to a very sudden epiphany anyway. He then realises that they're a bunch of crooks and murderers, which, given the various hints of the Holocaust reaching our shores, is a bit of a surprise that it's so late and so sudden. Until now, he'd found it possible to work with the Germans. After all, he'd been hunting murderers, and he had not had to search his conscience about that. But increasingly he found himself drawn into a deep, dark vortex, moving at a snail's pace, as things always happen in a nightmare. Both Huff and Kellerman are more interesting characters, as is Mayhew, and any of the three would make a more interesting protagonist. Likely Barbara Barger would as well, especially if it led to an expansion of Daniel Barger's involvement, because the ending is a particularly soggy squib, and if he was established as somebody to care about, then there might be a bit more impact to the belated American involvement. As it is, the American Marines that stage a raid on the atomic lab are introduced very briefly, and even that brief introduction serves little purpose because the raid itself takes place off camera as well, because Deighton prefers to tell us about Archer and his partner Harry drinking tea. For all its well-executed world-building, if SSGB was a story about that raid, beginning with the American justification of it and then building to its execution, then perhaps, with perhaps Barbara smuggling information out to her brother while she's operating in London, that probably would have been a more interesting story, and it would have built to a more exciting and impactful conclusion. Instead, Deighton's first 130 pages build tension, but the three-pronged battle for Archer's soul never gets as exciting as the opening promises. Part of the reason behind that is that Deighton is still introducing characters well into his third act. It really rather suggests that whatever designs he had when he started writing didn't quite work out as he planned, especially when those characters such as Daniel Barger and the Marines add so little to the finale. But there are also compositional decisions such as the scene where Archer and Harry drink tea with the railway signalman while the Marines are staging their raid. It's a very slow scene and it comes just at the wrong moment. In truth, the locomotive could have been put to better use, given that the natural association with them is sort of speed and movement. For example, the nation's signalman arranging passage of the rescued king across the network would have suggested a national unity at just the point where the book needed some impetus. Drinking tea is what we get. I suppose it is the national drink, but still. While the rescue of the king is a trap of sorts, that in his enfeebled state his freedom would do much to harm the British image worldwide, there is an alternative response to that as well, which would be an outpouring of sympathy and anger at the German government when his mistreatment was made public. I still can't believe that the German army would actually just let him escape to spite the SS. Nor is his escape done in a way that is particularly exciting. Archer and Harry drive a stolen ambulance into the tower, the king is loaded on board, and then they drive out with one of the guards helping them through the checkpoint. The ambulance breaking down does lead to a particularly tense scene where Archer is left in a gentleman's club while trying to get some help, but the problem is that the mission then seems to be calamitously organised. Harry and Archer being involved at all makes you wonder how small this resistance is, until we learn that there are 6 manned waypoints for it to go through anyway. Likewise, they fail to arrange any kind of alibi with their German superiors, which seems an unnecessary risk, just to their cover as much as to their lives. Is there really nobody else that the resistance could find that's better suited to that job? Perhaps some ex-soldiers? Clearly neither Harry or Archer were Boy Scouts, because not only did they not prepare any cover with their job, but they have no contingency for the vehicle breaking down either. It just gets more and more surprising, but not in a good way. Nor do they have any way to contact Mayhew, the plan's organiser, or anyone else involved in it. What if they needed to warn them that the plan had gone awry and that the Germans were coming for them? Now, Mayhew likely never planned for the king to be rescued fully, but he wanted him to die alongside the American Marines so that the Americans were moved by enough to open hostilities on the Germans. So he needed the plan to work that far at least. The mind blows that they didn't have an alternative vehicle planned, if only to aid the getaway, because the Germans would have started looking for that ambulance particularly promptly. For an author famed for meticulous planning and research, it's all a little bit surprising. That Barbara's killers answered the phone when Archer called her is also a little bit odd. In one of the key scenes of the book, Archer attends a high society party. This is where Archer meets Barbara Barger for the second time, and that really should be enough to convince him that the first time was no coincidence, but it isn't. It is also his first contact with the resistance. Archer is led down a long corridor, at the end of which is a room where he will have his first meeting with his contact. There was only one light, an elegant brass angle light with a green glass shade. It put a pool of yellow light on a card table, while making the rest of the room a mysterious jungle of verdant gloom out of which decapitated herbivores peered. Now clearly this is loaded with suggestive language, sending out ambiguous signals. The card table suggesting this is a moment where Archer will have to gamble. The one light suggests there's only one path. Yet also, one light is an article of faith, is it not? Something is not what it seems, reinforced by this obfuscating jungle, verdant, rich, green, flourishing, yet paired here with gloom. Herbivores, unthreatening creatures, yet paired here with decapitated, suggesting an unseen predator. Clearly something here is a hidden threat, a secret kept from him. But you would expect a writer that offers this kind of thoughtful prose to maintain that level throughout. So when we see this, the clouds that had been hugging to the earth, the last traces of summer warmth had gone. The air was cold. At another key moment when Archer was beginning to get the measure of what is going on, we can see this changeable weather as metaphoric, personifying his new inner clarity as the clouds lift, but then revealing the only path to him is foreboding. And later in the same scene when Archer walks through a prison camp, Deighton tells us they walked briskly. The wind was plucking at their coats and lashing the trees into a demented dance presented in a Nazi prison camp. The demented dance of the trees calls to mind the twisted klezmer of Shostakovich's Piano Triana Matu, doesn't it? And the same scene has the weather changing again. By now, dark clouds had closed across the sky and a drizzle of rain had begun. And though I'm sure that if I can make the previous two arguments stick, I can make one here that the weather changes again when the guard captain arrives and attempts to deceive Archer. The dark, obscuring clouds represent that, don't they? Well, actually, I don't think so. I think it's just some stuff that happens because you've got to have words in your book, even when they don't really mean that much. Because a writer that was that good wouldn't use the same trick 3 times in 10 or 15 pages. Writers that are that good have more tricks than that. And writers that are that good don't do this either. So this is part of the party scene that I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of information and description. While the narrator is third person, omniscient, etc., they very rarely stray from Douglas Archer's point of view. And here the thoughts that are presented to us are his alone. As you can see from the examples on the screen, it was like half awakening from some terrible nightmare, thought Douglas. Even an unattributed opinion like this, it was a magnificent house, is clearly his opinion because we're not presented with any different viewpoints, and it takes place over several pages. Douglas recognised a representative collection of London's new socialites. Across the room he saw Garin introducing a 17-year-old son David to a German colonel. Douglas turned to see Barbara Barger. She was particularly beautiful when she laughed, Douglas noticed. Yet then we get this one. Barbara Barger was not a very good dancer, but she was light on her feet and happy and ready to fall in love. Now clearly this is opinion, it could be hers, but it's not labelled as such, so as a reader you have to consider it a continuation of the existing narrative. But then how would he know that she's ready to fall in love? So is this now her narrative? Is this really what people think? And just a reminder, this is only the second time that these two people have met, so it's a really awkward line, and it would be hard to find a standard by which I would describe it as a good one. Later on, Deighton describes a different prison camp like this. Perhaps hell is like that, a discordant confusion of anxious souls. Some argued, some slept, some shouted, some wept, some wrote, some sketched, and many conspired about their coming interrogation. Now, clearly there are some poetics at play here. The slept, wept rhyme is obvious, the structure here equally so. But then what definition of sketched fits here without being contrived? One more example. Chapter 38 begins like this. You can see Bringle Sands and the mouth of the River Frayne from the very edge of the steep cliffs. This is the one and only time the narrator appeals directly to his narratee, and clearly as an isolated example you would think that he does this to draw the reader in, to create an intimacy or at the very least a proximity between the reader and what's going on. But it's only necessary here because this is where Deighton's characters are remotest from the action, the reader separated from where they naturally want to be. And that separation is a regular occurrence in the text. Not just here, where the Marines are coming unsure, unwitnessed by us as readers, because we're preoccupied with the tea that Harry and Archer are drinking. But it also happens when Barbara Barger dies, when Harry is arrested, and his subsequent attempt to escape from the prison camp. It seems like a conscious effort from Deighton to hide the most interesting parts of his story. And if you want to prove me right on that, count the number of scenes which are dominated by discussions of the tea being drunk. Very British, I'm sure, but not as exciting as the things we miss out on. Deighton had written 13 novels prior to SSGB and was known for his research and realism, and that certainly comes to the fore here for the opening parts of the novel. The depiction of a downtrodden Britain and the dangerous hints of the Holocaust are especially strong. The temptation of Archer by his three unpleasant suitors is not so much a build-up as a thrown switch, and without that build-up, he's not interesting enough a character to hold his own against the worst of the Germans or the British. The interfactional squabbling between the various German departments is not especially convincing and is far more convoluted than it needs to be, making the novel feel rather pedestrian as it moves towards its finale, rather undoing the good work of the opening. As a writer, Deighton is hard to get a handle on as well, as I've shown, with some really curious choices in structure and style. And I definitely feel that a more streamlined version of this plot, or shifting the focus away from the listless Archer, might have helped elevate SSGB above its peers. SSGB scrapes a thumbs up from me, but the wartime novels of Ken Follett or Jack Higgins are easier to recommend on their pure entertainment value, and if you're interested solely in the thought experiment side of things, so is The Man in a High Castle. Now, none of that makes SSGB a bad book, just one that doesn't really do justice to its own concept or the opening act, and because of that, it disappoints more than it delivers. So thank you very much for watching to this point, the end. This is the point where naturally I would ask you to like and subscribe and to check out some of my other videos. While you're doing that, I will just say goodbye and see you in the next one.